In the bitter winter of 1220, as the sun set behind the frozen dunes near Bukhara, a chilling silence fell over the ruins of the once proud Khorasmian stronghold. The Mongol banners fluttered in the icy wind, their shadows stretching like long scars across the devastated city. Smoke rose from toppled minarets, markets lay in ashes, and thousands of terrified civilians huddled together under the watchful eyes of Genghis Khan's disciplined but ruthless army. This moment was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was part of a systematic, codified strategy that the Mongols applied across Eurasia. And for the women captured in these conquests, the reality was far worse than anything shown in movies or historical dramas. The Mongol Empire, expanding at a pace never seen before or since, inflicted a level of subjugation, exploitation, and control over conquered populations that modern storytelling often simplifies. To understand the fate of captured women under Mongol rule, we must first understand the world from which this empire emerged, the culture that shaped their decisions, and the wars that made these tragic encounters inevitable. The early 13th century was a brutal era for almost every society. Kingdoms rose and collapsed in cycles of war, religious conflict, and droughts. But nowhere was the transformation more dramatic than on the Central Asian steppes. Before Temujin united the tribes under the name Genghis Khan in 1206, the Mongols lived in a harsh world governed by the traditions of steppe warfare, nomadic survival, and the Yosa, an unwritten code of laws. In this world, women had more mobility and authority than their counterparts in many settled civilizations. Mongol women could ride, fight, manage herds, negotiate alliances, and even influence politics during the Kurultai councils. But this internal respect did not extend to women outside their tribes. Captured women were viewed entirely differently. They were war prizes, symbols of dominance, and strategic tools used to secure loyalty or reward valor. Their treatment followed steppe traditions of conquest, rather than the more regulated systems of classical empires, such as Rome or China. Movies often portray Mongol brutality as chaotic or senseless, but the truth is more structured. The Mongols did nothing without purpose. Their campaigns were designed to break resistance permanently and create terror strong enough to force surrender. This approach spared Mongol lives while devastating their enemies. Women became part of this psychological operation. When a city resisted, its defenders understood the consequences: mass killings of warriors, forced deportations, and the distribution of women and children as captives. For the Mongols, this was not merely cruelty, but an extension of political strategy. Every woman taken, every family broken, and every lineage erased served to eliminate future rivals. To understand what happened to captured women, we must begin with the Mongol military system. Every Mongol soldier was expected to follow strict discipline. Looting was not random. After a city fell, officers conducted a census of people and possessions. The highest-ranking generals took first choice. Women considered noble, skilled, or physically healthy were often separated for the elite class, the households of generals, or the Khan's family. Others were given to warriors as rewards. Some were transported hundreds of miles to Mongol camps, forced into servitude and labor. Many were distributed among allied tribes as political gifts. This was a method the Mongols copied from earlier nomadic empires but perfected in scope. The scale of their conquests meant they captured hundreds of thousands of women over decades. One of the most documented cases comes from the fall of Nishapur in 1221, when Mongol forces, led by Tolui, stormed the city after the death of a Mongol prince. The slaughter that followed became legendary. Chroniclers from Persia recorded mass killings of men and the systematic rounding up of women and children. The Mongols separated them by age and perceived value. Many were enslaved, some forced into camp labor, and others taken by high-ranking officers. The goal was not simply plunder. It was the destruction of the city's social structure. Women represented continuity through family and lineage. By uprooting them, the Mongols shattered the ability of conquered peoples to rebuild. It is important to understand the cultural logic behind this. The steppe world viewed conquest as a cycle of violence. Tribes clashed, defeated groups absorbed into stronger tribes, and women played a central role in merging bloodlines or suppressing them. Temujin's own rise had been shaped by the kidnapping of his mother, Holon, by a rival clan. He never forgot the vulnerability that women faced in steppe politics. This influenced his approach to warfare. He believed that enemies must never have the chance to retaliate. Eliminating male warriors and dispersing women was part of this world view, but while Hollywood often shows only the violent aspect, the reality had many layers. Not all captured women were subjected to violence. Some entered Mongol society in roles that offered relative stability. Women skilled in weaving, cooking, medicine, or pottery were highly valued. Some became wives or secondary wives to Mongol nobles. Others became household managers, caretakers of herds, or attendants to Mongol princesses. There were even moments where captured women rose to significant influence. For example, Genghis Khan's descendants had mothers of various ethnic origins, including Tangut, Khitan, and Central Asian women taken during campaigns. These women later shaped political decisions at court. Yet none of these outcomes erase the fact that for most captured women, the Mongol invasions meant fear, displacement, and forced submission. The empire's rapid expansion created endless streams of refugees. Women marched in columns across thousands of miles, sometimes barefoot, often starving, driven by soldiers who had little concern for their suffering. The hardships of long, distance, forced migration claimed many lives. Chroniclers like Juvayni and Ibn al-Athir documented these scenes with sorrow, describing endless caravans of captives walking behind the Mongol army. The Mongols also practiced a selective breeding policy. Women considered especially beautiful or skilled were kept within the elite circuits, while others were assigned to labor. The Khan's household alone housed hundreds of women from various regions. This was not unusual for the era, but the scale reached by the Mongols was unprecedented. Their empire stretched from Korea to Hungary, giving them access to an enormous diversity of populations. Many women never saw their homelands again. At the same time, it is important to correct modern misconceptions. Some movies portray Mongols as savage raiders with no structure or governance. In truth, the empire they built required administrative talent. Captured women sometimes worked within these structures. Chinese, Persian, and Turkic women served in textile production, mills, herding operations, and caravan management. The Mongol system was efficient but merciless. It absorbed useful populations while discarding others. Women had no choice in their fate. The tragedy of these women is often overshadowed by the legendary image of Mongol cavalry charges and battlefield tactics. But behind every victory was a reshaping of the population. The Mongols turned human beings into assets to be redistributed. This was not unique to them, but the speed and intensity of their conquests amplified the suffering drastically. In places like Merv, Balkh, and Urgench, whole populations were uprooted. Women faced decisions that no movie can capture fully. Survival required adaptation, silence, and acceptance of a new identity imposed on them. Understanding this context sets the stage for the deeper story of what truly happened to captured women during Mongol expansion. Their experiences were not random incidents, but essential threads woven into the vast and often brutal fabric of Mongol imperial strategy. As the Mongol Empire surged across Asia in the early 13th century, each conquest deepened the pattern of destruction, displacement, and human redistribution that defined Mongol warfare. By 1002, 119, when Genghis Khan launched his full-scale invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, the world was already witnessing a transformation greater than any since the days of Alexander. Cities that had stood for centuries fell in days. Once, thriving populations vanished almost overnight. The speed of Mongol victories shocked chroniclers from Persia to China, but beneath the battlefield triumphs lay a quieter, more consistent strategy that changed millions of civilian lives, especially women. To understand how the treatment of captured women escalated, we must examine the Mongol military machine. The Mongol army was not a loose horde, as romanticized tales suggest. It was a highly organized system based on decimal units, strict discipline, and a logistical structure capable of sustaining long campaigns. Every soldier, whether a simple archer or a veteran commander, understood that failure to obey could mean death. This discipline extended to the handling of captives. Looting or seizing women without permission was strictly forbidden until generals completed the assessment of a conquered population. This was the first escalation. The Mongols institutionalized the capture and distribution of women. It was not an uncontrolled byproduct of war, but part of the administrative process. When a city resisted, the Mongols considered its population forfeit. Jalal al-Din, the Khwarezmian prince who led the resistance against the Mongols, witnessed the consequences firsthand. Cities such as Otrar, Bukhara, and Samarkand suffered immense losses. Men of fighting age were executed, while artisans and useful workers were separated from the general population. Women were sorted into categories: noble women, artisans, laborers, servants, and the very young. Movies often portray a simple scene of chaos, but the reality was far more methodical. The Mongols used interpreters, scribes, and officers to manage the process. One of the most impactful examples occurred during the fall of Urgench in 1221. The city's resistance was fierce and prolonged. When it finally collapsed, Mongol chroniclers claimed that tens of thousands were killed. Women were dragged from their homes and lined up before commanders. Gilani, a Persian chronicler, describes how women were distributed according to rank, with the most desirable sent to the households of Mongol princes. Others were marched away as camp followers or forced into labor battalions responsible for cooking, sewing, herding animals, and transporting supplies. This system escalated Mongol efficiency. Women became part of the mechanism that sustained the empire's expansion. Slave labor supported military campaigns. Women skilled in weaving produced clothing for soldiers. Others repaired saddles, cared for horses, or prepared preserved foods such as dried curd and meat strips, essential to Mongol mobility. The fate of these women was not glamorous or romanticized. It was hard, punishing work that required endurance through harsh winters and long marches. The Mongol expansion into northern China between 1211 and 1234 further intensified the fate of captured women. The Yuan Dynasty, which ruled northern China, had fortified cities, large populations, and advanced administrative systems. When the Mongols broke through after years of warfare, they absorbed countless women from urban centers like Zhongdu, Kaifeng, and Taiyuan. Chinese chronicles recorded the despair of these women, many of whom were uprooted from sophisticated city life and thrust into the austerity of steppe existence. They went from silk garments to rough felt, from stable homes to yurts that moved every season. Some perished during forced relocations that spanned thousands of miles. During these years, Genghis Khan and his successors also used marriages strategically. High-ranking Mongol nobles married women from conquered royal families to legitimize control. These women were not mere trophies. They were political instruments, bound to new masters and cut off from their native worlds. A Tangut princess, for example, married Genghis Khan despite the deep enmity between their people. Another example is the Khitan and Uyghur women who entered Mongol courts through arranged captivity. While some gained influential positions, others lived with the sorrow of forced separation. Outside the political sphere, the escalation continued in the daily realities of camp life. Women marched behind armies, sometimes covering 20 or 30 miles in a single day. The Mongols demanded constant movement, and captives had no choice but to follow. Chroniclers note that during the campaigns in the Caucasus, Armenian and Georgian women were taken by the thousands. These regions, renowned for their beauty and craftsmanship, became significant sources of captives. The Armenian historian Korokos of Ganzak wrote bitterly that women were taken far away, scattered across territories, never to return. The Mongols also implemented population transfers. When they conquered a region, they often relocated skilled people to other parts of the empire. Women who worked in pottery, textile production, and midwifery were valuable assets. Yet, relocation meant cultural erasure. A woman taken from Samarkand might find herself living with a Mongol family in Mongolia or serving artisans in northern China. Many never spoke their native language again. This was a quieter form of violence, one not shown clearly in movies, where focus falls on battle scenes rather than cultural loss. But for these women, losing identity was often as painful as losing freedom. The Mongols also developed a legal structure for managing captives through the Yasa. Though the text of this code was never officially written, chroniclers like Juvayni and Rashid al-Din document many of its principles. Among them was the rule that women captured in war became property of the victors. They had no right to appeal, no mechanism to regain freedom. Their children, unless fathered by Mongol nobles, could be assigned to labor groups or assimilated into Lo, Anking clans. This reinforced the Mongol dominance of conquered territories. When the Mongols pushed into Eastern Europe in the 1230s, the same pattern continued. After the Battle of Legnica in 1241, Polish and German chroniclers documented the abduction of women from villages and towns. While exaggerated numbers are common in medieval writings, there is consistent agreement that women were taken en masse. The Mongols did not establish long-term settlements in Europe, but still applied their policy of human extraction. Women from Hungary, Poland, and Bohemia were transported toward the east. Many died on the journey. Those who survived were absorbed into the vast human mosaic of the empire. The escalation reached its legal and administrative peak under Ojdeh, and later under Monk and Kublai. As the empire grew into a multi-continental structure, the number of captured women expanded into the hundreds of thousands. In China under the Yuan Dynasty, census records show stark demographic shifts. Populations of certain regions dropped significantly, and the number of households registered as slaves or dependent families increased sharply. Women formed a major part of these dependent households. Their roles ranged from domestic service to agricultural labor in newly controlled farmland. Another layer of escalation was the psychological warfare associated with the treatment of captured women. News of Mongol actions spread ahead of their armies. Cities often surrendered because they feared annihilation. The possibility of women being taken, separated from families, or subjected to abuse created panic. The Mongols used this fear deliberately. The threat alone dismantled defensive alliances. For example, when word reached Baghdad in the late 1250 about what happened to the women of Nishapur and Merv decades earlier, the fear contributed to political instability. The Mongols understood that terror was a weapon. Women were part of that weapon's symbolic power. By the mid-13th century, as the Mongol Empire reached its greatest height, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the plains of Hungary, the consequences of its early conquests began to reveal a deeper and more disturbing truth. The fate of captured women, long overshadowed by military narratives, became a defining element of the empire's social and political structure. What began as a wartime practice evolved into a permanent institution that shaped the lives of millions. This was the turning point where the Mongol system transformed from a brutal wartime necessity into a complex, empire-wide machinery of human redistribution, control, and cultural erasure. For many women, captivity did not end when battles ceased. Their lives unfolded in stages that movies rarely portray. The first stage was the chaos of conquest, the second was relocation, the third was assimilation or permanent servitude, and the fourth, which modern audiences seldom hear about, was the psychological transformation required to survive in a world that denied them identity, family, or the hope of return. One of the most documented examples of these transformations comes from the accounts of Rashid al-Din, the Persian historian who recorded the lives of various peoples under Mongol rule. He describes how women from Central Asia, especially those captured during the Khwarezmian campaign, were taken deep into Mongolia. Some served in the households of noble families, others cared for livestock, tended yurts, or prepared dried food for soldiers. Their daily routines were strict, repetitive, and physically demanding. Yet within this harsh environment, some women managed to adapt, learning Mongolian customs, languages, and survival methods. However, adaptation did not imply acceptance. Many lived with the trauma of separation. Chroniclers recount that during the relocation marches, some women attempted to escape or took their own lives to avoid forced assimilation. Their stories, though rarely preserved in detail, emerge through the laments recorded by Islamic and Chinese writers. Ibn al-Athir described the fall of Merv, where thousands of women were taken away and families were shattered forever. His writing speaks of grief so deep that communities could not recover their cultural identity even generations later. One turning point in the treatment of captured women emerged during the reign of Ojdai Khan, when the empire shifted from rapid conquest to administrative consolidation. As regions such as northern China, Central Asia, and Persia came under long-term occupation, Mongol leaders realized that stability mattered as much as victory. This meant controlling populations more efficiently. Women became part of the empire's administrative framework. They were assigned to noble households through official lists. Some were registered as dependent families responsible for producing textiles, grain, and dairy products. This was particularly evident in northern China under the Yuan Dynasty. Census records from the era show massive changes in population categories. The Mongols created classifications such as household slaves, artisan families, and agricultural dependents. Women formed a significant proportion of these groups. Instead of being treated as temporary war spoils, they became permanent labor assets tied to estates, military colonies, or administrative centers. This shift marked a new stage in their fate. Their identities were rewritten by bureaucracy, not just by conquest. At the same time, political marriages became a tool of empire building. Mongol nobles frequently married women from conquered royal families to strengthen legitimacy. These women often lived complex lives. On one hand, they entered elite circles. On the other, they were isolated from their cultural roots. A well-known example is the mother of Kublai Khan, Sorgatoni Beki. Though not a captive herself, she represented how Mongol women from various cultures could rise to power. But for every woman who achieved influence, thousands remained invisible, absorbed into households far from their homelands. Another important turning point was the Mongol invasion of the Middle East under Hulagu Khan in the 1250s. When Baghdad fell in 1258, the shockwaves across the Islamic world were immense. Chroniclers such as Ibn al-Fiwati and al-Mustafi described scenes of devastation and displacement. Women from Baghdad, Mosul, and other cities were swept into the Mongol system. Some were taken to Central Asia, while others served in new administrative centers established by the Ilkhanate. Their role in these regions mirrored earlier patterns: domestic labor, textile production, and support for military households. What makes this period crucial is the scale of human movement. The Mongols were not merely conquerors, they were relocators of entire populations. women from the Middle East met women from China, Korea, the Caucasus, and Central Asia in Mongol-controlled territories. This unprecedented mixing of cultures left lasting marks on language, art, and social customs. For example, the textile designs of the Ilkhanate era show Chinese and Persian influences merged together. This blending was made possible in part by the forced integration of skilled women from different regions. Yet behind these cultural exchanges lay the darker truth of lost identities. Women who were once part of scholarly, aristocratic, or artisan communities lived the rest of their lives as nameless members of new families. Movies often show conquest as a single event, but for these women it was a lifelong sentence of displacement. Generation after generation grew up without knowledge of their origins. The Mongols also established a network of ordo camps, each functioning like a mobile administrative unit. Women played a central role in maintaining these camps. They cooked, prepared milk wine, managed household supplies, and cared for children. Some were responsible for crafting felt coverings for the yurts. These coverings were essential for survival in the harsh Mongolian climate. Without the labor of captive women, the empire's mobility would have been severely limited. Another aspect rarely shown in films is the distribution of women as gifts during diplomatic missions. Mongol envoys often carried lists of captives who could be presented to allied tribes or loyal commanders. This practice reinforced loyalty and ensured political stability. For the women involved, however, it meant repeated displacement. A woman taken from Samarkand might be handed to a Mongol commander, later gifted to a Uyghur ally, and eventually end up living among Turkic tribes. With each transfer, she lost more of her original identity. The turning point also involved demographic consequences. Scholars studying genetic markers in Central Asia, China, and the Middle East have found traces of widespread population mixing dating back to the Mongol period. These changes cannot be understood without acknowledging the forced movement and assimilation of women. Their lives, though rarely recorded, shaped the genetic and cultural landscape of Eurasia. During this period, some women did rise to prominence. In the courts of the Ilkhans, for example, women such as Cuchulainn and Bilogan Khat influenced political decisions. Some women advised rulers, mediated alliances, or managed estates. These exceptions highlight that the Mongol world was not uniformly oppressive. However, they also underscore the contrast between a small elite and the vast majority whose lives were lived in hardship. Finally, the psychological impact of Mongol captivity on women created a long shadow across generations. Many regions affected by the Mongol invasions recorded cultural trauma in folklore, poetry, and oral traditions. Persian laments, Armenian hymns, and Chinese folktales preserved memories of women taken far away, never to be seen again. These stories survived not because chroniclers focused on individuals, but because entire communities carried the memory of loss. This turning point in the fate of captured women reveals the true complexity of Mongol rule. It was not simply brutality. It was a systematic, empire-wide transformation that rewrote cultures, shaped populations, and altered the human map of Eurasia. Women were both victims and participants, burdened by displacement yet sometimes integrated into powerful families. Their experiences expose the deeper reality hidden behind the dramatic battle scenes shown in films. By the time the Mongol Empire fractured into 4 major khanates in the late 13th century, the world had already been reshaped in ways no civilization had ever experienced. The stories of battles, cavalry charges, and conquests are widely remembered, but the long-term experiences of captured women reveal an even deeper transformation. Their fate, often overshadowed by military history, shaped the identity, culture, and demographic structure of entire regions. The consequences of Mongol policies toward women did not end with individual suffering. They carved permanent marks across Eurasia, many of which still influence societies today. To understand this final phase, we must examine the long-term aftermath. What became of these millions of displaced women, how their lives influenced the societies they entered, and how the legacy of Mongol conquest lived on through cultural shifts, population changes, and new political structures. Movies often end the story with the fall of a city, but the real conclusion unfolds decades later in villages, courts, and households across the vast Mongol territories. The first and most immediate consequence was demographic transformation. The Mongol conquests caused massive population loss, particularly among men. In regions like Central Asia, the Middle East, and northern China, entire male populations were wiped out during sieges or battles. This shift created imbalances that altered marriage patterns, inheritance systems, and social structures. Women, especially those taken captive, became the conduits through which conquered populations were absorbed into the Mongol world. Children born to Mongol fathers and women from China, Persia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe formed new communities. These children often grew up by lingual or even trilingual, blending steppe customs with local traditions. Over generations, these mixed populations became the backbone of the successor states: the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Yuan Dynasty in China. Thus, the fate of captured women was directly tied to the development of new political identities across Eurasia. In Persia, for instance, the Ilkhanate's blending of Mongol and Islamic traditions was heavily influenced by the influx of women taken from across the region. Many were assigned to noble households, where they raised children who later played critical roles in government and the military. Chronicles from the 14th century mention the distinct cultural shift in Persian court life, with Mongol customs merging into Persian etiquette. This fusion was not accidental. It was built upon the presence of thousands of women who carried local traditions into their new families. In China, the Yuan dynasty's ruling elite was a mosaic of Mongol, Turkic, Chinese, and Central Asian influences. Captured women helped transmit agricultural techniques, textile designs, culinary practices, and medical knowledge across different ethnic groups. The Yuan court employed women in textile workshops, where Chinese silk weaving blended with Central Asian designs. This was one of the earliest moments in history where artistic styles from distant regions combined so fluidly. Without the relocation of skilled women, such cultural fusion would have been impossible. In Eastern Europe, the Golden Horde created a society where Mongol rulers relied heavily on local women captured during the campaigns of 1002, 123, and 1002, 141. Although many women suffered permanent displacement, their children grew up forming the administrative class of the Horde, adopting both Mongol political culture and Slavic or Turkic customs from their mothers. This mixed heritage can still be traced in the cultural evolution of early Russian principalities and the identity of later Tatar groups. The long-term consequence was a new cultural landscape, neither fully Mongol nor fully local, but a blend born from conquest. Another consequence was the spread of certain technologies and practices across regions. Women transported against there will often brought skills from their homelands. Chinese women taken during the Jin and Song campaigns introduced techniques for silk reling, embroidery, and herbal medicine to Central Asian and Middle Eastern households. Persian and Central Asian women brought textile dyeing methods, bread-making traditions, and midwifery knowledge to China and Mongolia. While their relocation was tragic, the practical knowledge they carried had a lasting impact on local economies. The Mongols also institutionalized the dependence on female labor in administrative and military support systems. Women played significant roles in ordo camps. They produced dairy products that fed armies, crafted felt coverings that insulated yurts against the bitter Mongolian winters, and managed livestock herds essential for cavalry operations. This labor contribution was not temporary. It became a permanent feature of Mongol successor states, influencing gender roles long after the empire dissolved, but the most enduring consequence was psychological and cultural. Communities that suffered Mongol invasions carried trauma across generations. Persian historians often wrote with sorrow about the disappearance of women into distant lands. Armenian hymns mention mothers waiting for daughters who never returned. Chinese folktales include stories of women taken westward during the wars. These collective memories preserved the emotional imprint of Mongol conquest, shaping cultural identity and influencing how societies viewed their past. In some regions, the trauma became part of national memory. For example, Central Asian historians in later centuries described the Mongols as a force that broke the lineage of entire cities. This phrase reflects not only the loss of life, but the erasure of family trees through the forced relocation of women. Such memories continued to shape literature, poetry, and oral traditions long after the Mongols had vanished from political power. There were also long-term political consequences. Because Mongol rulers frequently married women from conquered royal families, successor states often had mixed ethnic lineages. This blending influenced court politics. A ruler with a Persian mother, for instance, might lean toward Islamic customs. A Mongol prince raised by a Chinese mother could favor Confucian advisors. These maternal influences shaped political decisions, religious conversions, and cultural preferences. In this way, captured women indirectly affected the governing style of multiple khanates. For example, the Ilkhanate's conversion to Islam under Ghazan Khan was influenced by the Islamic environment in which he was raised. While not directly a product of capture, this environment was partly shaped by the presence of thousands of women from Islamic societies who lived in Mongol households. Their faith, rituals, and daily practices subtly reshaped the cultural atmosphere of the ruling class. This reflects a deeper truth. Cultural transformation often begins in households, not battlefields. In the Yuan Dynasty, the increasing Sinicization of Mongol rulers was influenced by the Chinese women present in their courts. These women preserved Chinese literature, court etiquette, and rituals within the palace. Over time, the Mongol elite absorbed aspects of Chinese governance, leading to administrative reforms that aligned with traditional Chinese practices. Again, the influence of captured or assimilated women played a quiet but significant role. Another consequence was the rise of new social hierarchies. Many captured women became part of the lowest social classes, while others, especially those who married nobles, rose to high positions. This created a unique social landscape where lineage did not always reflect ethnicity. The wife of a Mongol prince might be a captured Tangut or Persian woman, yet her children became legitimate heirs. Meanwhile, some women of noble birth, captured during war, lived the rest of their lives as servants. These dramatic reversals illustrate the unpredictability and harshness of the Mongol world. By the 14th century, as the Mongol Empire declined, the descendants of these captured women formed part of new societies. In Persia, they blended into local populations. In Russia, they helped shape the emerging identity of Tatar and mixed Mongol Slavic groups. In China, they contributed to the fabric of communities that later formed under the Ming Dynasty. Their impact was not erased by the collapse of the Mongol system. Instead, it lived on quietly in cultural practices, physical features, languages, and traditions. Perhaps the most profound consequence is this: the Mongol conquest made Eurasia more interconnected than ever before. The forced movement of women, while tragic, contributed to the exchange of knowledge, culture, and technology across continents. The Silk Road flourished not just through trade, but through people who carried their traditions across vast distances. Captured women, though victims of war, became unintentional agents of cultural transmission. In summary, the long-term fate of captured women under the Mongol Empire reveals a story far more complex than battlefield violence. Their suffering shaped demographic patterns, influenced political decisions, transformed cultural landscapes, and left deep psychological scars on communities. They bore the weight of conquest, yet their presence across Eurasia helped create new societies and cultural identities that continue to exist today. Their story is not merely one of pain. It is one of endurance, transformation, and silent influence. The Mongol Empire may have risen and fallen, but the legacy of the women it displaced still shapes nations, cultures, and histories across the world.